3/25, 1945, the Oval Office, Washington, D.C. Harry S. Truman had been the President of the United States for exactly 13 days. The weight of a global war was already crushing him, but the men who walked into his office that afternoon were about to make the burden exponentially heavier. Secretary of War Henry Stimson entered, accompanied by Major General Leslie Groves. Groves was a large, abrasive man who carried himself with the intense, paranoid energy of someone holding a radioactive secret. He locked the doors to the Oval Office. He ensured there were no aides, no secretaries, and no listening devices. Then, Groves handed Truman a highly classified 24-page memorandum. The first sentence read, "Within 4 months we shall in all probability have completed the most terrible weapon ever known in human history, one weapon of which could destroy a whole city." Truman read the document in absolute silence. He was reading the blueprints for the apocalypse. The memorandum detailed a sprawling $2 billion industrial empire employing over 130,000 people. It described the splitting of the atom, the processing of uranium-235, and the creation of man-made plutonium. When Truman finally looked up from the paper, the terror he felt was not just about the destructive power of the bomb. The terror was rooted in a profound, humiliating realization. He was the commander-in-chief. He was the man who would ultimately have to give the order to use this weapon. And until Secretary Stimson had pulled him aside after his swearing in a few days prior to whisper a vague warning, Truman had possessed absolutely no idea that the Manhattan Project even existed. What Truman didn't know was that his ignorance was not a bureaucratic oversight. It was a deliberate, calculated decision made by Franklin Delano Roosevelt. The man who had chosen Truman to be his vice president had actively, intentionally walled him off from the greatest military secret in the history of human warfare. To understand why Roosevelt would keep his own heir apparent completely in the dark, you have to understand the terrifying psychology of a dying president who believed he was the only indispensable man in the world. By the summer of 1944, Franklin Roosevelt had been president for 12 years. He had guided the nation through the Great Depression. He was commanding a two-front global war. He had centralized executive power to a degree never before seen in American history. And he was dying. His blood pressure was catastrophically high. His heart was failing and his energy was evaporating. The Democratic Party bosses knew Roosevelt would not survive a fourth term, which is why they executed a ruthless political coup at the 1944 convention to remove the radical Vice President Henry Wallace and replace him with a safe, pragmatic compromise, Senator Harry S. Truman of Missouri. But to Roosevelt, Truman was not a partner. He was not a confidant. He was merely a piece of political mathematics. Truman was put on the ticket to appease the conservative wing of the party and to secure the Midwestern vote. Once the election was won in November, Roosevelt essentially discarded him. During his 82 days as vice president, Truman met privately with Roosevelt exactly twice. They did not discuss grand strategy. They did not discuss the Yalta Conference or the post-war division of Europe. Roosevelt treated Truman like a ceremonial nuisance, a man whose only job was to preside over the Senate and attend state funerals. But the secrecy surrounding the Manhattan Project went far deeper than Roosevelt's personal disdain for his vice president. It was rooted in a deeply ironic, near-fatal collision between Truman's past and Roosevelt's paranoia. Before becoming vice president, Harry Truman had made his national reputation as a crusading senator. He chaired the Senate Special Committee to investigate the National Defense Program, universally known as the Truman Committee. His mission was to hunt down waste, fraud, and corruption in the American military-industrial complex, and he was ruthlessly effective at it. Truman's committee saved the American taxpayer billions of dollars by exposing shoddy manufacturing and corrupt contractors. In the summer of 1943, Truman's investigators noticed something mathematically impossible. Hundreds of millions of dollars were disappearing into the budget of the War Department without any corresponding output. Massive amounts of steel, copper, and specialized machinery were being shipped to a secluded valley in eastern Tennessee called Oak Ridge, and to a desolate stretch of desert in Washington state called Pasco. Tens of thousands of workers were being hired. Entire secret cities were being built from scratch. And yet, no tanks, no airplanes, and no bullets were coming out of these facilities. To an auditor like Truman, This looked like the greatest financial fraud in the history of the United States. He ordered his investigators to descend on the sites and subpoena the military commanders. General Leslie Groves panicked. If the Truman Committee began holding public hearings, the greatest secret of the war would be splashed across the front pages of the New York Times. German intelligence would instantly realize the Americans were building an atomic bomb. Groves went to Secretary of War Henry Stimson. Stimson, a highly respected statesman, picked up the phone and called Senator Truman. The conversation was incredibly tense. Stimson told Truman that the facilities in Tennessee and Washington were part of a highly classified project. "I cannot tell you what it is," Stimson said, "but it is the greatest project in the history of the world, and if you investigate it, you will destroy it." Truman was a patriot and a loyal soldier. He trusted Stimson. He called off his investigators and locked the files away. He backed down, but Roosevelt never forgot that Truman had almost blown the lid off the Manhattan Project. When Truman was elevated to the vice presidency a year later, Roosevelt and his inner circle maintained a wall of absolute silence. They viewed Truman not as the future commander-in-chief, but as a former auditor who asked too many questions. They believed that the best way to keep the secret from leaking was to ensure that the vice president simply didn't know it. The architecture of this secrecy, however, contained a brutal, devastating irony. Franklin Roosevelt compartmentalized information to an extreme degree. He didn't just hide the bomb from Truman, he hid it from his own Secretary of State. He hid it from the vast majority of his senior military commanders. The commander of the Pacific Fleet, Admiral Chester Nimitz, had no idea the bomb existed until the final months of the war. General Douglas MacArthur, the man commanding the ground forces preparing to invade Japan, was kept completely in the dark until days before Hiroshima. Roosevelt believed that by restricting the knowledge to a tiny, microscopic circle of men, himself, Stimson, Groves, and Winston Churchill, he was ensuring the absolute security of the weapon. What Roosevelt didn't know, and what Truman would later discover to his absolute horror, was that the secret was already out. While the Vice President of the United States was deliberately kept blind, the intelligence agencies of the Soviet Union were reading the blueprints. The Manhattan Project had been deeply infiltrated by Soviet spies. Klaus Fuchs, a brilliant theoretical physicist working at the highly classified Los Alamos laboratory in New Mexico, was handing over detailed schematics of the plutonium implosion lens to the NKVD. Theodore Hall, the youngest physicist at Los Alamos, was passing technical data to Soviet couriers. David Greenglass, a machinist working on the bomb's detonators, was delivering sketches to Julius Rosenberg. The security apparatus engineered by General Groves was intensely focused on preventing German sabotage and keeping American politicians like Truman away from the facilities. But they completely failed to stop the ideological espionage of the communists. The lethal paradox of the Roosevelt administration was this: Joseph Stalin, a brutal foreign dictator, was reading technical reports about the atomic bomb in the Kremlin, while the Vice President of the United States was reading the Washington Post in his office, completely oblivious to the fact that the nature of human warfare had been permanently altered. The enemy knew the secret that the heir apparent was denied. When Roosevelt died on April 12, 1945, the bill for this arrogance came due instantly. The transition of power was a chaotic, terrifying nightmare. Truman was thrust into the presidency at the exact moment the war in Europe was ending, and the war in the Pacific was reaching its bloodiest climax. The battles of Iwo Jima and Okinawa were resulting in catastrophic American casualties. The military was drawing up plans for Operation Downfall, the invasion of the Japanese home islands, which projected hundreds of thousands of American deaths. And Truman had to make decisions on these terrifying scenarios while trying to speed read through 12 years of hidden Roosevelt diplomacy. The April 25th briefing with Stimson and Groves was the moment the blindfold was finally ripped off. Groves explained the mechanics of uranium-235. He explained the Trinity Test, which was scheduled for July in the New Mexico desert. He explained that one airplane carrying one bomb could obliterate an entire city. Truman listened, absorbing the shock. He didn't panic. He didn't lash out at the men who had kept the secret from him. Instead, he recognized the sheer, unadulterated burden of the presidency. He later wrote in his diary that he felt as though the moon, the stars, and all the planets had fallen on me. But the true cost of Roosevelt's secrecy was not just Truman's initial shock. The true cost was paid at the geopolitical negotiating table. In July 1945, Truman traveled to Potsdam, Germany, to meet with Winston Churchill and Joseph Stalin to decide the fate of the post-war world. During the conference, the message arrived from New Mexico. The Trinity Test was a success. The bomb worked. The explosive power was far greater than the scientists had predicted. Truman, armed with this terrifying new reality, decided he needed to inform Stalin. He believed he was holding the ultimate diplomatic trump card. He walked over to the Soviet dictator without an interpreter, relying on Stalin's translator, and casually mentioned that the United States had developed a new weapon of unusual destructive force. Truman expected Stalin to be shocked. He expected the Soviet leader to demand details, to show fear, or to ask questions. Stalin did none of those things. He simply nodded, smiled politely, and said he hoped the Americans would make good use of it against the Japanese. Truman walked away, believing he had successfully intimidated the Soviet dictator while maintaining the utmost operational security. He thought he had played the moment perfectly. What Truman didn't realize until years later was that Stalin wasn't surprised because Stalin already knew. The Soviet dictator had been thoroughly briefed by his spies. In fact, Stalin knew about the atomic bomb long before Harry Truman did. As soon as Stalin returned to his private quarters after that conversation, he ordered his foreign minister, Vyacheslav Molotov, to speed up the Soviet atomic program. Roosevelt's culture of extreme secrecy had created a catastrophic intelligence gap. By treating the vice presidency as a political dumping ground rather than a partnership, Roosevelt ensured that the man negotiating the future of the free world at Potsdam was operating at a massive psychological disadvantage. Truman thought he was revealing a secret. Stalin knew he was playing a game. The ultimate decision to drop the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 remains the most debated military action in human history. To end the war and prevent the slaughter of an invasion of Japan, Truman authorized the use of the weapons. He made the most consequential decision in the history of the species. But the philosophical legacy of the Manhattan Project's secrecy is a chilling warning about the nature of executive power in a democracy. Franklin Roosevelt was undeniably a great war leader. He possessed the strategic vision to guide the Allies to victory, but his fatal flaw was his hubris. He treated the United States government as his personal fiefdom. He believed that his own intellect and his own charm were the only things holding the world together. He failed to recognize that the presidency is not a man, it is an institution. By failing to prepare his successor, by deliberately hiding the atomic bomb, the Yalta agreements, and the true nature of the Soviet threat from his own vice president, Roosevelt committed a profound dereliction of duty. He won the war, but his arrogance nearly lost the peace. Harry Truman had to master the nuclear age in a matter of weeks. He had to pivot from total ignorance to absolute authority overnight. He was forced to fight the beginning of the Cold War while simultaneously trying to discover the secrets his predecessor had hidden in the desk drawers of the Oval Office. The story of the hidden bomb proves that in a world of apocalyptic weapons, secrecy can be a necessary shield against the enemy. But when a leader uses that same secrecy as a weapon against his own government, against the very man who must take his place, it ceases to be security. It becomes sabotage. Roosevelt built the weapon that ended the greatest war in history, but it was Truman, the man kept deliberately in the dark, who had to bear the terrifying responsibility of carrying humanity into the atomic age. And he had to do it alone, forced to navigate the blinding light of the nuclear fire, completely blindfolded by the man who lit the match.